welcome everybody. This is a panel discussion. So I have a couple of questions here which I thought up and somebody else in the room has helped with. But I think it's really important that we get questions from the audience. There was a lot of nice chatting earlier, so I think we've got a great opportunity to explore some of these topics in a bit more detail, and we can be very probing and try not to be rude, but you can be as forthright as you want to. I'll say from a couple of questions that came up earlier, I have two solutions here, so it's not going to be a wholly negative exercise. But to get it started, I'm just going to ask each of the panel members to respond in turn to a question which I have, which is just kind of setting the scene, and you get the opportunity to get your standpoint across to the audience. So if you could just say who you are and what is, in your mind, what is net zero for supercomputing? Okay,
can we start first? Okay.
You were hoping it's going the other way, weren't you?
Okay, so I'm Antonin Portelli. I'm a professor of particle physics from the University of Edinburgh. I'm also part of the technical directorate of DIARC, so try to think about technical direction for the facility. What was the question again? What is it? Net zero?
What is net zero? What do you think it is in the context of supercomputing in particular?
Yeah, so I think, obviously we cannot do science without spending energy. So supercomputer will keep spending a lot of energy. I think it's not something we're going to avoid. So it's mainly about policy making and influencing user behavior. So, to increase the efficiency of what's being spent, I would separate that completely from the aspect of what the searcher themselves cost, because they are employed by institutions which have to worry about that, and it's a somewhat separate problem. And so it's mainly increasing the efficiency, always increasing the value of what we're doing through, peer reviewing and making cases and not, really asking scientists to justify the interest of what they're doing. And on the policy side to offset carbon, and that's all we eventually reach net zero, I guess. Yeah?
Okay.
Okay,
Catherine.
So I'm Kate and I'm from Hartree Centre. So I have been listening to this conversation with massive interest because my background is as a geoscientist. So I'm a geologist. I've worked at the British Geological Survey for much of my career before I came to the Hartree Centre. So I have quite a different view on this. And you've talked a lot, and no one could disagree with you that we should be using computers wisely. We can optimize our code, we can look at using the right simulators, we can look at benchmarking, we can look at CPUs versus GPUs. And I had a bit of a fun conversation with somebody hiding at the back, Andrew Jones, so that was great actually at lunchtime. And we were talking about the Green 500 and what that actually means. And I said, but it's fair enough to talk about flops versus watt ratio, great, but what energy supply is it using? And we look at Lumi, for example, in Finland, who's using 100% hydroelectric power. That is a net zero HPC. And the other point I would get to you is, it is all very well looking at a very tiny part of the climate agenda, which is what the energy source is. So I'll bring in my geoscience background and say, you are using huge amounts of rare earth elements. They are not grown, they have to be dug up. So anything you can't grow, you have to dig. And those rare earth elements are finite resources in the same way that we talk about oil and gas reserves. So we also need on this agenda to be thinking about what are we making our chips and semiconductors out of, and how can we take that to another stage to make it more sustainable. So I wanted to add that as a slightly different flavour to what we've been talking about this afternoon.
Excellent, thank you.
So Alistair Basden from Durham University and part of DIRAC. And I think there are two things, aren't there? There's the embedded energy, which doesn't concern UK DRI because it's manufactured away from the UK. So, it doesn't affect the UK's carbon budget. And then there's also the electricity consumption, which in 20 years' time, the grid will be nice and green. And so, again, we won't need to care. So it's only a short-term problem, isn't it, for us?
all. James?
Yeah, I suppose. Jamie from UCL, and it was something that was on your slide actually about the combustion that I then wondered, should we as people who own compute, should we be incentivizing green applications on our devices? Is that actually an even more effective way than just making our own, devices greener? Should we be saying, you're doing bad things? You're not, BP, you're doing terrible things. We should, you get half as many core hours as someone else. I think that's an an interesting difference in how we could look at our own, not necessarily our own carbon costs, but how we can influence the carbon costs of people we interact with.
Okay, so you're raising kind of a bit of a skeleton in the room, or an elephant. Is like not just the computing you're doing, but what you're doing with it. Should that be taken as a value judgment in the amount of energy you can use for your computing? And by implication, is the research you're doing worth it? I think that's a difficult university decision. So I'll go.
It's a serious consideration at STFC at the moment.
How would you approach that? Is it worth approaching? Should we just run away from that one?
Yeah, I think it's an excellent point. Actually, although I didn't suggest anything, that's something I was thinking during the previous coffee break. I think one element that was not missing but a bit behind a lot of the thing that we're saying in the talk is the value of science. Is how do you quantify the value of science, or how do you assess the value of science? Because if we put that away, which was done in a lot of the argument, then I can tell you what the most energy efficient way of using a supercomputer, you just don't use it. Right? And yeah, that's very energy efficient. So of course we're going to use it, and of course it's going to spend more energy than if it's doing nothing, but then we need to assess what it is. And one thing I've said a lot recently thinking about energy efficiency is, I think Alastair is right. Projects should be charged by the energy they spend, but that should not be the only thing. I think in the same way we assess project, for example, in a facility like Dirac that, give project to research team, in the same way we assess them to prove that their science is worth it and prove the software they use is going to make good use of the resource, well, maybe we should add energy efficiency to the list. And instead of trying to make general rule about what is a good energy efficient project, we should push that down to the scientific community, as we do with paper, grants, anything, to go through a peer review process that, where a group of experts that actually understand what the software is doing say, well, this is not good enough, or this is much weaker than this other thing, or, where there is an effect where you can really assess based on the science which is produced if it's worth spending the energy on it. Yeah. So I think peer reviewing is key for me in increasing energy efficiency.
Just on that point, obviously you see this, don't you? When I look across the university at different domains and they use some core hours, waste of energy. Some domains are just heavy in computations. Your domain, for example, is a particularly heavy one. So if you look at impact per core hour, and you look at the impact factors of research groups on our machine, and how much core hours they consume, which I do, you see a big shred, like some typical high energy uses. Your domain is a particularly heavy one. So there are some domains which, to get one paper out, have to burn shed loads of core hours. Other domains, in clinical medicine, for example, use hardly any, and they get lots of high impact journals. So there is just a domain spread. I'm not saying one is right and one is wrong, but there is a natural spread of core hours consumed, energy consumed, just because of the type of work it is. That's difficult to make value judgments.
Yeah, but the impact of science is not judged by the number of papers, right?
Yeah, well, it's just how you judge good science, like impact or whatever. This is a philosophical question. But if you're trying to judge the quality of science, impact is one of them. And so you can study this now. And impact factor versus core hours consumed. There are things in Google Split that look at this. And it's quite an interesting activity.
I I don't know. Again, I'm very skeptical about putting single metrics on this type of thing. That's why I'm insisting on peer reviewing. I think there should be kind of a hierarchy of circle of experts that actually understand what is being studied and what the impact it is, and that can put it in context of the scientific competition, that can advise higher circle whether they think it's worth it or not. And I think we're doing that already, right? With grants and computer time, it's just that energy efficiency is not part of the criterion. So I would think science already have a working system for all these things, just energy efficiency need to be added to the list of constraints.
I sort of agree with some of the field review, and that's great when we're talking about national or regional centres where you've got the billion at a time. But if you take the argument down to the university level, where you're providing a system, it comes back to like challenges of ethics and full economic costing, and there's no consistency in how it's applied or how it's distributed. Some sites, it is charged and you have to put together a proposal, other it's free at point of view from the university. And so if you're asking researchers to be able to put together proposals, I know from your experience, you've got some researchers that can quite well define how many core areas that need storage and what they need in their code profile. But I can probably say 85% of the researchers on particularly tier 3 style systems don't have a clue about that code base. They're not interested in that code base. It's a tool for getting the work done. So how do you incentivize them to want to improve and get their code forward? Because they're also have incentives to do. We'll say we are experts in running the systems and tuning the environment, but we're not the code. So going into the plethora of skills that are required, it's not a simple challenge. But when you start, because if you start to do peer review at that level, where's the support?
It's not even the code, is it? Because you're the community code, they've got no idea what
That's also very interesting in that tier 3 systems typically won't be peer reviewed. Whatever goes on them, anyone can use them, but they won't be peer reviewed. And I wonder how many bitcoins have been mined on tier 3 systems. That's interesting.
And a lot of it is speculative as well. And research in itself has to be speculative, at least at some point.
Yeah. I know.
One example, I will be very brief, sorry. One example is, can we think about the energy and environmental impact of the LHC accelerator? I mean, it's massive compared to HPC. And as a particle physicist, I'm not sure I feel more and more, we discovered the Higgs bosons, there's all kind of thing, but at the end, the LHC is just saying year after year that the theory of particle physics is extremely precise and everything happened like expected. And it might be the case for 10 decades. It's not our fault, it's just the law of the universe happened to have nothing really new happening for several scale of energies. Does that mean we should stop research on that because it costs a lot of money? No. So again, it's the value of science cannot only be quantified by metrics X and Y. I mean, there is also, the perspective of our center, because maybe the LHC is not going to find anything, but the next accelerator that will reuse all the technology and all the experience we're training from is going to find something. You see what I mean? So I think that's why, again, it should go back to the scientists to judge the value of their own science, basically. Sorry.
I have a view from STFC, and in actual fact we were talking about particle accelerators and HPCs, and I would say that whether people like it or not, we are already talking about this facility, whatever that facility is. Okay, it uses a lot of energy. We know that. A particle accelerator quite eloquently explained how much energy that uses. HPC is exactly the same. It's what in the lifetime of that facility is it helping in terms of helping a climate change and net zero agenda? And that won't be all its science, but if we can prove that certain amounts of it, or it could even be done on lives saved. So if we've saved X number of lives because of the new types of treatment that we've come up with, and those people have gone on to do things that have supported us in terms of net zero, you can start to look at, it's not an ideal way, because ideally what you'd like to do is save power, but at the forefront of research, as you've all quite rightly said, you don't necessarily always know the results. So if you look at the impact of our facilities over 10 and 20 years and look at what we've achieved from a top level down, not looking in the nitty-gritty of how many peer review papers, that's another metric, and I understand the debate on that one. But for us within the facilities and within UKRI, it's really looking at the impact. It's looking at what did we do. So if Hartree works with UKAA and all of you working with UKAA and we solve the power of fusion, we have done a massive step forward to a net zero world.
Can I just comment on that, because there's something I made a note of this during your talk. Turning it around to be devil's advocate, what if it doesn't work? Because we're using fusion as an example of something we will need to compute for.
Yeah.
Maybe it doesn't pan out. So I think what you said is really important, that there'll be a lot of stuff, a lot of good things generated along the way as well. We need to be tracking those in case it doesn't work, because if fusion isn't the panacea in 20 years' time, then all of that compute that was invested, you could argue was wasted, but it's the things alongside it that would be.
But if I've moved petrochemical companies off using petrochemicals so that their shampoos and conditioners are not wasting petrochemicals, then that's a good thing too. Yeah. So that's why I think we need quite a big look at that impact, and I think that's why most people will struggle with it, because I don't think there's a one answer.
I was going to say, is this the impact of quantity versus quality? Because how do you define quality?
Well, the one thing we struggle with in Hartree is obviously I have to quantify our impact. That's what I'm measured on. I'm not measured actually on the number of peer-reviewed papers. That's nice. That's, for me, is a nice to have. It's the impact I've made with UK PLC. And we use quite blunt instruments like GVA, and there's a set way in the government that you can do that. But a lot of the time it's about talking to the companies and keeping in contact with them. I think that's the best way of doing it, and keep going back and keep getting them to answer surveys to find out what impact you've actually made.
For societal benefit?
Yeah.
Alistair, anything?
I forget what question was now.
Offset carbon.
Finger at the value of science or research as somebody who runs a system.
Okay. So
you should do that.
As someone who runs a system, I guess I bow to the superior wisdom of the resource allocation panels and run what I'm told to run.
Good point. So I think where there is some talk coming back, the systems administrators or the sensors should control that, we're not really qualified to do so, and it has to go back to those panels who have the people who do that.
And they're the ones that then look at the science output and grade, and they're the ones that you hope would be qualified to do that.
Yeah, did you have
Yes. Apart from working in IT, I'm also a gentleman scientist. So during the daytime, I'm supporting IT. In the evening, I'm turning into a gentleman scientist. And one thing I really like is I can do blue sky research. I can tap into all of the holes of the knowledge we are still having, and I can actually do it. I've got absolutely no idea what my impact will be, of what the impact of my research will be in a few years' time. But I'm hoping by filling in these gaps, I actually produce a much better fabric of knowledge. I can do that. But the moment we are starting and looking down far too much on what is the impact of your science in 5 years' time, we are having a tunnel vision and we are losing out on really vital science. And that is one thing we have to bear in mind. And that means that older hardware, for example, why not using that for explorative research? Because at the end of the day, we also invested a lot of energy to get the silicon dioxide to send into a silicon chip. I worked in semiconductor industry, so I know how much energy is getting into there. So why not using that? Or even a teaching cluster. So there are a few.
Does anybody have numbers on that? Because we've talked about
we've been debating this for a while, actually. It's a hard number to put. But one thing that there is somewhere, there is a trade-off, isn't there? Somewhere your embedded carbon gets outweighed by running machine that's 30 years old, just because it's not efficient. And I'd love to know where that is. I suspect, because we're running systems that are 11 years old, I suspect we should have turned them off. But on the other hand, running a system that's only 4 years old and turning it off, as some places do, that's probably not long enough. So it's probably somewhere between that, which would be great to know, wouldn't it?
But on the other hand, I've got a list on my laptop of 150 colleges in the U.S. that have zero clusters that would really love to get your systems.
But they would be, in terms of...
More scientists and things like that.
Yeah. Okay. So in the US, that's a different carbon budget. Doesn't the DRI of the UK isn't affected by the carbon that the UK. But anyway, let's say they're in the UK. Okay.
Let's say they are in the UK.
Let's say they're in the UK. They would be better. The question is, would they be better buying a new system that's far more energy efficient?
Let's take that out. They don't have the money. That's why they haven't invested.
Well, okay. Long term. Are they better? Long term, they would have the money because it's more expensive to run these older systems, and that's then a question that they have to do. They invest on a new system to save money long term? You know, that's outside the scope of this conversation, I think. But again, it comes to what's this level of embedded, and that's it's the reason that people. That's what you have to think about if you're buying a car. You know, do you buy a brand new electric car? And you know, if you're a high mileage user, probably makes sense. But if you're a low mileage user, and you're doing a few thousand miles a year, it probably makes sense to keep a Morris Traveller going.
I think we can't cost that stuff. I did the calculation just the other day on my ice lakes. So the capital cost of running those ice lakes for 4 years at today's energy costs is half the capital cost.
Exactly. But what we don't know.
So if you have a system which is half as energy efficient, which a system of 4 or 5 years old would be, then you actually
2 years. Exactly. And then the other thing into that is the embedded, what the equivalent embedded carbon is.
If those American universities had to pay their power bill,
yeah,
it would be actually cheaper for them to buy a new system than run one that's 6 years old.
Exactly.
UK costs of power today.
Exactly. Yeah, no, exactly. It's the same goes with everything in life, really, isn't it? Do you buy new or do you keep old going?
Jamie,
I guess that conversation you had about kind of solar panels ties into that. Right? So say for instance, if there was a recycling initiative within HPC loans to give them to other places, and instead of them actually investing straight away in a customer that then spend money on power, they invest in solar panels and got the HPC system donated as an incentive for them to actually become green. Does that then generate a new market?
Or do they take out a loan, buy solar panels and a new system, and then do even better, don't they? You know.
Absolutely.
Or do they just use the tier one system?
So maybe there is kind of an incentive for suppliers to give that kind of opportunity to get a job.
I mean, one thing that's coming out of this course is utilisation is key, isn't it? We want to keep these things utilised, which perhaps means tier 3 systems. Universities ought to be thinking, do we need a tier 3 system? Could we have a tier 3 system that's half the size, quarter the size, and make better use of a shared resource somewhere, or burst out to cloud, or something like that?
Does anybody have an empty tier 3 system?
No.
I think the demand overall is so high that it would be unrelated.
Perhaps I'm thinking previously. But, yeah.
I do actually have a question that ties into what Paul was saying earlier. Is it better to iterate fast and fail fast and continue to iterate, or save power and save money?
Iterate what?
Is it better to iterate quickly and have potential failures and iterate through your jobs really quickly? What's better for science? Is it to iterate fast, or is it to actually save power?
In terms of your daily runs?
Yeah.
I think it depends what you want. At the end of the day, what is it that you're doing and trying to achieve? Because I'll go back to a business. If you're a business and time is money, and that is the overriding effect, and actually putting that computer on for a shorter period of time, but it's higher energy, rather than using a smaller amount of energy but over a longer period of time works better for you, then that's what you should be doing. I don't think there is a right or wrong answer to that question.
Yeah, I guess it's one of those obvious ones of it depends on the use case.
So, I mean, if I can add something, I mean, one practice I was trying to push really hard on my team, I told you about the coffee break, is quality assessment of jobs being submitted, because at least in our field, especially everything which is mathematical physics, I mean, generally when you run very large scale jobs, it's not because they do anything different from the small jobs, it's just because they run more realistic physics. but a lot of the debugging, correctness, understanding, mathematical understanding what the job does, in many cases you can do it on your laptop. But you will do it in a situation which is very unrealistic, meaning you're not going to produce any science out of that. But mathematics is mathematics, it works at all kind of scale. And so I've, many students, postdocs sometimes just have their head on the job and they directly want to run it they don't want to think about it, they're in a hurry to deliver a project. And at least in our team, we've been spending a lot of time trying to give incentive to people, what the laptop incentive one I always give, like you won't need to compile the job, it would be simple, just run a laptop, try to understand how it works at a very small scale, and then the production run, you understand how it works. And so to answer your question, it's iterating a lot and failing a lot, but doing it in a scale where you don't harm resources, financial, environmental, computational, whatever. And when you need to use 500 nodes to run a job, then you need to do it once you've proven to at least a certain number of your peers that this is actually worth it.
So we're saying fail fast at the macro level as opposed to...
Yeah, that's right. So I think encouraging people to really practice small-scale job and being creative with it just to assess the quality of what they're doing is very important.
So we're coming to the end of half an hour. I've got one more personal question. So as I'm in charge, I can ask it. And it's a pet topic of mine, which is these supercomputers produce vast amounts of energy, consume vast amounts. They produce vast amounts of warm water, now quite hot water, which we should be looking at using that energy as the output from our supercomputers for other purposes like district heating and hot water and swimming pools and sports centres and things like that. So when I was at the University of Bristol, I did a lot of chatting with our sustainability people, and that technology is there. The new buildings they are building are going to have heat pumps to heat them. So they could use any kind of relatively low-grade heat to provide heat for university buildings or for city centres and things like that. Each member of the panel, quickly, why isn't that happening? Or should it be? Or is it happening in your area? Start with James.
Yeah, imagine bureaucracy. It's hard to link up industries, isn't it? Yeah.
In the centre of the city, there's plenty of buildings. Kathleen Lonsdale is a drafty cold building.
Yeah, I don't know.
So you fully support that idea?
I would, yeah.
Alistair?
So yeah, in Durham, we're heating the skies around Durham.
That's
With our
nice.
Is that
CO2.
helping astronomy or something?
We don't do astronomy in Durham anymore. That finished in the 19th century. No, we now fly to islands in the ocean. So rather than you're right. No, so rather than pumping our heat into the atmosphere, what we ought to of course be doing is heating buildings, etc. But I have this fear that in Durham we will get it wrong and we'd heat the buildings in the summer and waste the heat in the winter or something. But no, more seriously, of course that only works for half the year. The swimming pools is probably better, you do it for more of the year. The reason I think it's not been done in the past, and it's not a good reason, is that it was cost, isn't it? Capital cost. People were building data centres, not usually at the same time as they were building a building that wanted heating. It might be further away, and these things weren't so, I don't know why, they weren't so important. I mean, climate change has been on the political agenda since the 80s. Why we've not done anything until very recently beats me. But you know, it's really all come down to cost and it not being, people not feeling it's been worthwhile.
So maybe a question mark against university management.
But I think now, any university that's building a new data centre, I hope they would be seriously considering what they're going to do with that waste heat.
Okay.
Cost is the biggest issue. It absolutely is the biggest issue. I mean, I'm building a new data centre and we had brilliant ideas and the costs went up like this. We were told to cut it to meet the budget. The first thing that went was all the other stuff that we really wanted to do, and we were really upset. We're still hoping we can retrofit because we're designing it so that we can, but in a government situation when you're always never quite got enough money, that's the problem. I think the other thing is consistent supply is another issue. So if you are providing heat to a swimming pool, or like we just jokingly said, we could heat all the buildings at 4 a.m. in the morning, or when nobody actually wants the heat, or we could heat it in the summer because that's when we've got most of the heat and that's when we want to get rid of it. That becomes a problem. So some of the things that we need to think about is how do we use that supply consistently to provide a consistent service to that organisation that we're giving it to.
Well, the output from a supercomputer is pretty consistent. That's something that estate people don't know until you tell them. But you say it's running full speed all the time, it's never going to be empty. They go, oh, well, actually, that's not quite so bad.
Yeah.
Any comments?
Yeah, I asked the facility in Edinburgh because we've been running a number of 100% water-cooled systems, so this would be relevant. I don't remember exactly what their answer was, but I do remember the point that was just made, that first there was just a large technological cost of integrating this latent heat into the heating system. There were also some management constraints that you need to put together different estates department to actually design a solution that will achieve that. And it's challenging with timelines you generally have in this situation. But I think people should make more effort. I think really this is something that should be done.
I think there's an issue with kind of lack of joined up thinking in the funding, because we get capital separate from operations. Even what Alistair was saying about you invest in capital to reduce your OPEX. The OPEX is a separate budget, so it just reduces your capital budget. It should all be a whole package, and if you could put the whole thing together and include things like, we can put this energy, recycling part in, and that will then offset some of the OPEX. That would be a joined up way of doing it. And so the cost is a problem, but there's nothing, it just becomes a cost at the moment because it's just hitting the capital budget.
I was going to suggest the same kind of thing as the cost of offset, in that linking up with industry. But if they had applications for hot water, if they were about to generate the hot water for them, they would be willing to invest in taking that supply and doing something with it, which then generates so you can link with industry and say, and I jokingly said it kind of when I was at SJC, I said, well, why don't you just get a brewery and make it?
That was a good idea.
But actually, there are industry uses for those.
Well, there's farming being a key one.
So whiskey distillery.
Your question
I guess it's not cheap to kind of offset.
Your question was that you
pretty much less online questions. It's a whole other conversation that's happening. So it's been quite interesting to see the fact that they can't actually talk to each other. So it's going back and forth between hosts and panelists back to the people. But it's a great conversation that's happening online as well. Don't really have any other questions. There is one question in terms of...
Before you go to another question, just closing this part. Your question was related to the UK only, or a general question worldwide?
Globally. And I know
because there are people that are doing that today.
Yeah.
Lumi's doing it.
Years. Germany.
Yeah, like 10 years ago.
Yeah, we're particularly bad in the UK, I think.
Yeah.
Because it gets more practical since we're moving towards on-ship cooling, right? So the wastewater is getting hotter.
That's right.
Yeah.
So the energy is going to be more useful. We did a study in Cambridge looking at providing heating to a whole new building project. And we paid a consultancy quite a lot of money to look into this. And their answer came back that modern buildings can't really use the energy. It's not, they don't have enough of a heat
They're too well insulated.
Because they're too well insulated. They need nothing in the summer. In the winter, their demands are low. The only thing that made sense in Cambridge to dump the power to was to a swimming pool.
Yeah.
That made economic sense. But the buildings were not economic.
Sports centres work.
Sports centres work. Other things.
Retrofitting old buildings, but then again.
That was when the energy was, hot water was cooler. And now that hot water is hotter, it makes slightly more sense. So I think
it is making more sense to do it.
At the British Geological Survey, we heated our rock warehouse with the heat from the supercomputer centre, which was brilliant because it was a great big warehouse. Leaked heat everywhere.
But then I suppose the questions of the actual detail.
To get people to work in, if it could be just above freezing, it was quite good.
It was really useful for that. So if your university is thinking of various energy circuits, having a constant load that can take that power from a solar farm is really useful.
So they should be looking at that.
Mine's just a little comment, and it's more around educating users and our ROCs that work in collaboration, and how everything is so fast these days in computation, and everyone is so used to a strong Wi-Fi connection that gets things delivered really quickly. If we are going to be using and measuring power, how do we deal with the extended time? And how do we bring users through that journey, knowing that this is for better goodness for the science, the outcome, the environment? And then equally, Paul, to you. Previously, you mentioned moving people to big bits of data, big amounts of data for calculations. How does this factor in to that?
That's the other one, isn't it? Data transport costs are huge. So when you ship data around big data repositories and then one computer with data science, more sensitive. So this is a complex topic, but I think people are saying that the energy to move the data around is probably more than the energy testing within the computation. We haven't talked about that at all here, we've just been concentrating on the energy to use to create those primary data products. But then what's happening with that secondary data analysis and how that issues around actually adds up to more content. I think that's pretty well understood.
Well, I think we're probably at our time now. Thank you very much, Pavel, for your